Warning: this story contains extreme violence, slasher elements, and murder. I encourage you to listen to the entire story, and if you enjoy this type of content, please subscribe and press the bell icon to stay updated. Air was thick with the smell of damp hay, rot, and something far more sinister. Beneath the picturesque horizon of an isolated farm, hidden from prying eyes, the Wardell family kept a secret buried deep beneath the soil. It wasn't crops or cattle that sustained them, it was something far more grotesque. The barn loomed in the distance like a silent sentinel, its wooden exterior warped and ancient. No one who entered that barn ever returned. The locals whispered about it, told stories to scare their children. But no one believed the tales, until they found themselves inside. Jess woke to the clinking of chains. Her wrists ached, rubbed raw by iron shackles. Her body felt cold, splayed across a rusting metal cage just big enough to sit in. She could hear faint, raspy breathing all around her. Eyes adjusting to the dim light, she realized the truth, and here were others, many others. Some barely conscious, their bodies slumped over, while others were dead, their flesh pale, skin hanging loose from their bones. Tubes ran from their arms, siphoning blood into containers on the floor like livestock being milked. "Help me!" a voice croaked from a cage beside her. A man, his face gaunt and sunken, lips split savagely. He was too far gone. Panic seized Jess's curiosity. She pulled at her chains, her breath quickening. The metallic clang echoed through the barn. She wasn't the only one trapped here, but she would be damned if she was the next to die. That's when she heard the door creak open, the heavy thud of boots echoed through the barn. A silhouette appeared in the doorway, a hulking figure with a broad-brimmed hat, his face obscured by shadow. But Jess had heard the stories. This was Henry Wardell, the patriarch of the farm. His reputation stretched through the town like a foul stench, but no one dared confront him. And used to haul hay bales. In the other, he dragged a bucket, its contents sloshing with a dark, red fluid blood. "Time to feed the soil," he muttered, voice gravelly with years of smoke and malice. His eyes gleamed with something wicked, a hunger that went beyond food. He approached one of the cages, where a woman sat unconscious, her skin pale as death. He plunged the hook into her stomach, twisting it with an awful squelching sound. Blood poured out like a ruptured pipe, pooling onto the dirt floor. The woman didn't scream, she couldn't. Her body had long since stopped responding. She was just meat now. Henry tilted his head towards the ceiling. A grin forming on his cracked lips as if he were savoring the moment. "A good harvest this year," he whispered to himself, the hook sliding out with a sickening pop. "Real good." Jess was trembling now, her breath shallow, trying not to make a sound. Henry passed her cage, the smell of blood thick in the air. There was a purpose behind all of this. It wasn't just about harvesting blood. There was something ritualistic, almost ceremonial, in the way Henry worked. Beyond the barn was the farmhouse, where the rest of the Wardell family waited. Margaret, his wife, was no less deranged. She was the one who tended to the extractions, slicing into flesh with surgical precision, keeping the victims alive long enough to drain every drop of blood and carve out whatever organs she needed for her concoctions. Their two sons, twins with dead eyes and wicked grins, had the job of hunting down any wanderers unfortunate enough to pass through their land. But it was the father who conducted the ritual. Jess had heard it whispered among the captives, how Henry believed blood held power, that the earth could be fed with human sacrifice. That was why they never just killed outright. They needed it slow. Painful. The sounds of suffering became a dull background noise, a constant reminder of what would come next. Jess needed a plan, and fast. She couldn't sit here, waiting to die like the others. a noise broke through her thoughts, something from the far corner of the barn. Another survivor, a young man with eyes full of rage, had managed to pick the lock of his cage. Jess caught his gaze as he crept forward, finger pressed to his lips. "Stay quiet," he mouthed. He moved like a shadow, avoiding the pools of blood on the ground as he neared her cage. "I'm getting us out of here," he whispered, his spilt hoarse. "But we savoring be fast. Once they know we're gone." The clang of metal rang out as the lock on Jess's cage gave way. She stumbled out, weak but determined. They freed 2 more survivors, an older woman and a man who could barely stand. The barn door creaked open. They slipped into the night, hearts pounding, but freedom was only a fleeting illusion. The moon cast a pale light over the fields, but Jess knew they weren't alone. The twins weehartut there, hunting like rabid wolves. Every rustle of leaves, every snapping twig, was a warning. The survivors sprinted towards the edge of the farm, breath ragged in their throats. But the twins were faster. One of them appeared from the darkness, a twisted grin plastered across his face as he swung a machete at the older woman. The blade connected with a wet thud, and blood sprayed across the grass. She collapsed, gurgling as her life drained from her. Jess and the others kept running, but the twins were closing in. Jess grabbed a rusted pitchfork from the ground, her fingers trembling. "Come on!" she screamed, her voice filled with fury. The twin lunged at her, and she drove the pitchfork into his chest with a sickening crunch. Blood poured from the wound. The Wardell family would come for them. They would want their blood, and they wouldn't stop until every drop was spilt, but Jess wasn't going to let that happen. Not anymore. They had taken her life, her freedom, but she would take their blood. The woods were thick, branches clawing at Jess and the others as they stumbled through the underbrush. Every snap of a twig or hoot of an owl made Jess's pulse race. She could feel it. Henry Wardell was coming. The old man was like a predator who could smell blood in the air, hunting with a relentless hunger. They paused in a small clearing to catch their breath. The young man who had freed them, Ben, was leaning against a tree, holding his side. His shirt was soaked in blood from a deep slash he'd taken during their escape. "We can't stop," Jess urged, but she knew they needed a plan. Running blindly wasn't going to save them. Ben's face was pale, eyes flickering between consciousness and delirium. "We need to fight," he rasped, gritting his teeth as he pushed himself upright. "If we keep running, we're as good as dead." Jess nodded. There was no escape if they couldn't face what was coming. The Wardells thrived on fear. If they were going to survive, they'd have to turn the tables. The distant rumble of a truck engine shattered the night. The headlights pierced the trees like the eyes of a beast. Jess's heart pounded as she saw the old farm truck barreling down the narrow dirt road, its headlights sweeping across the woods. "We have to split up," she said, her voice steady despite the terror gnawing at her insides. "It's the only way to confuse them." The older man, Frank, nodded grimly. "Meet back at the farmhouse. If we're going to end this, we end it where it started." Jess and Frank dashed into the trees, the others, but Jess had no intention of running forever. She clutched the bloodied pitchfork tightly, the iron cold against her palms. She could hear Henry's gruff voice barking orders from the truck. "Find them. Kill the rest, but I want her alive." Jess's blood turned to ice. They weren't just hunting for blood, they wanted her for something worse. She moved swiftly through the trees, her legs aching, until she found herself near the farmhouse. Its windows were dark, its structure looming like a silent tomb. A scream tore through the night, sharp and agonizing. Jess froze. It wasn't far. She had to move, had to help. Racing towards the sound, she emerged into a small clearing, where the twisted outline of one of the twins was illuminated by the moonlight. He had caught Ben, who was pinned to the ground, blood pouring from a fresh gash in his stomach. Ben's face was a mask of pain as the twin dragged a knife slowly across his skin, savoring every moment of agony. The blade dug deeper, twisting cruelly. Ben's screams echoed through the woods, but they were drowned out by the sound of the twins' maniacal laughter. Jess couldn't wait any longer. She charged, lifting the pitchfork high, and plunged it into the twins' back with all her strength. The prongs tore through muscle and bone, a wet crunch splitting the air. The twin shrieked, dropping the knife as blood gushed from the wound. He writhed, gasping for breath, as Jess yanked the pitchfork free and stabbed him again, this time in the throat. The blade sunk deep, severing his windpipe, and his body crumpled to the ground in a pool of dark, glistening blood. Jess's heart raced, but there was no time to linger. She knelt beside Ben, who was pale and shaking, barely clinging to life. His breaths were shallow, his eyes glassy. "Go," he whispered, his voice weak. "Finish it." Jess bit her lip, knowing he wouldn't make it. Jess reached the farmhouse as the first glimmers of morning began to creep over the horizon. The structure was more decrepit up close, the stench of rot and blood filling the air. Inside, she knew Margaret was waiting, along with Henry. They had to be stopped, no matter what. She stepped through the back door, the hinges creaking ominously. The interior was a grotesque blend of farm life and slaughterhouse, with blood-soaked tools lining the walls and jars of organs preserved in formaldehyde. The smell was overwhelming, but Jess pushed forward. A noise came from upstairs, a dull thudding sound, followed by soft sobbing. Jess tightened her grip on the pitchfork and made her way up the stairs, careful to avoid the creaky floorboards. The door at the end of the hallway was ajar, and beyond it, the sound of whimpering grew louder. Jess peered inside. It was a macabre altar, the room drenched in blood. Margaret stood over a young woman strapped to a table, her body riddled with cuts and incisions. The woman's blood was being siphoned into jars, her cries weak and hoarse. Margaret's expression was one of calm efficiency, her hands slick with gore as she worked. "You're just in time for the harvest," Margaret said, turning to Jess with a wicked smile. "We'll need you next." Jess lunged. The pitchfork drove into Margaret's abdomen, piercing through flesh and bone. Margaret let out a guttural scream, dropping her scalpel as she clawed at the metal sticking from her belly. Blood poured from the wound, soaking the floor beneath her. With a final, violent twist, Jess pulled the pitchfork free. Margaret's body crumpled to the ground, twitching as life drained from her. Jess felt no satisfaction, only a cold resolve. There was still one more. Jess heard the heavy footsteps behind her before she could react. Henry was there, and dangerous. This farm has fed on blood for generations. You can't stop what's already been sown. Jess squared her shoulders, gripping the pitchfork tighter. Henry lunged at her with terrifying speed, the cleaver flashing in the dim light. She dodged, narrowly avoiding the blade as it buried itself into the floorboards. Henry was strong, but Jess was faster. She jabbed the pitchfork toward him, but he caught it in his massive hand, twisting it out of her grasp with ease. He swung the cleaver again, grazing her arm, the sting of the wound sharp and hot. Jess stumbled back, blood dripping from her arm. Henry advanced, his eyes wild with murderous intent. He grabbed her by the throat, lifting her off the ground with unnatural strength. "You were always meant for this," he snarled. "Your blood will feed the earth. It'll make this farm thrive." Jess gasped for air, her vision blurring, but in one last desperate move, she reached into her pocket and pulled out a small shard of broken glass. With a scream, she drove it into Henry's neck, twisting it as deep as it would go. Henry's eyes went wide, blood gushing from the wound. He dropped Jess, clutching at his throat as he staggered back. Gurgling, he collapsed to the ground, blood pooling around him. Jess stood over his body, gasping for breath. The sun was rising, casting a red glow over the blood-soaked farmhouse. The harvest was over, but Jess knew that, in some dark corner of the world, it would begin again. The sun's rays barely warmed the blood-soaked earth as Jess stumbled from the farmhouse, her body trembling with exhaustion, her mind consumed by the horrors she'd witnessed and committed. The air was thick with the stench of death, the field stained red with the lives sacrificed to the Wardell family's twisted ritual. But the nightmare was Henry. Yet the farm seemed to pulse with life beneath her feet, as if something deeper was at play. A dark force, something ancient and malevolent, had been fed for years, and its hunger was far from satisfied. Jess glanced at the horizon, the rising sun casting long shadows across the twisted landscape. She knew she had to leave, to escape whatever remnants of evil lingered here. But as she turned towards the dirt road, a sound stopped her dead in her tracks. It was a slow, deliberate creak, the sound of wood groaning beneath the weight of something heavy. The barn door was opening. Jess froze, her heartbeat pounding in her ears. She had killed the family. It was over. But that noise, that haunting creak, it sent a chill down her spine. Slowly, she turned to face the barn, its black maw yawning open as if inviting her back inside. The shadows within writhed, alive with the echoes of the tortured souls that had perished there, and then she saw them. Emerging from the barn were the bodies. Pale, blood-drained, and stitched together like broken dolls, the victims shuffled forward. Their hollow eyes stared at nothing, their mouths open in silent screams, a grotesque parody of life. The blood taken from them had animated their corpses, binding them to the earth like twisted marionettes controlled by some unseen hand. One of the bodies dragged itself toward Jess, Ben's body. His skin pallid and slack, his face twisted in an eternal grimace of pain. Blood oozed from the gash in his stomach, soaking the ground beneath him as he clawed forward. Jess stepped back, her breath caught in her throat. No, this can't be happening. The bodies, dozens of them, staggered and crawled from the barn, their movements jerky and unnatural, as though they were still being harvested by an unseen force. Blood dripped from their torn bodies, leaving a crimson trail, held together by crude stitching that gave the impression of a butcher's hand. Their hands reached out, fingers twisted and broken as if begging for help, for release from their eternal suffering. But there was no humanity left in their eyes. They were nothing but vessels for the farm's blood ritual, puppets controlled by the dark force beneath the soil. Jess's legs were numb, her mind screaming at her to run, but her body was frozen in place. The sound of wet, dragging feet grew closer, the sickening squelch of blood-soaked earth underfoot, and then, from behind the shuffling dead, a voice, low, guttural, and full of malevolent glee. "You think you stopped it?" It was Henry's voice. "You think killing us meant something, girl?" From the shadows of the barn, Henry's body emerged. His neck was still torn open, blood bubbling from the gaping wound Jess had inflicted, but his eyes burned with a fiery, unnatural light. His lips pulled back into a gruesome smile, blood-stained teeth gleaming in the dim light. "You were just the beginning," he rasped, his voice an echo of death. "The earth demands more. It will always demand more." Jess backed away, her mind racing for an escape that seemed impossible. The dead were closing in on her, a mass of broken, mutilated bodies reaching out with clawed fingers. Behind them, Henry stood tall, a mockery of life, his voice booming in the stillness. "Every drop of blood spilled feeds the soil. Every scream, every cry, makes it stronger. You think you can just walk away?" He laughed, a sound that curdled the air. "You're part of it now. You can't leave." Jess's mind was in chaos. She glanced at the fields, at the farmhouse, at the bodies that surrounded her. Everywhere she looked, the land seemed alive, breathing, heart racing, her lungs burning. She needed a weapon, something stronger than a pitchfork, something that could finish what she'd started. In the kitchen, she found an old hunting rifle mounted above the fireplace, caked in dust and grime. She grabbed it, her hands shaking as she fumbled to load the bullets. The footsteps of the dead grew louder outside. They were coming for her. Jess took a deep breath, steadying her nerves. She wasn't going to let this place take her, not without a fight. She would destroy everything, burn it all to the ground if she had to, but before she could make a move, a soft voice drifted through the air, chilling her to the bone. "Don't fight it," the voice whispered. It was Margaret. Jess turned slowly. Margaret's body, still bleeding from the brutal wounds Jess had inflicted, stood in the doorway. Her eyes were wide and empty, her face stretched into a grotesque smile. Blood dripped from her lips as she spoke. "Your blood is ours now. You can't escape. The farm always needs more." Jess lifted the rifle and aimed it at Margaret. "Go to hell." She pulled the trigger. The blast echoed through the farmhouse, and Margaret's head exploded in a spray of blood and bone. Her body crumpled to the floor in a twitching heap, but Jess knew it wouldn't stay down for long. The dead were relentless. She couldn't kill them all. She couldn't fight the entire farm. But she could destroy it. Jess grabbed a lantern from the fireplace, smashing it onto the wooden floor. The oil spilled out, spreading in a slick pool. With a flick of a match, the flames erupted, consuming the farmhouse in a roar of fire. Jess ran for the door as the flames spread, the heat searing her skin. Outside, the dead had gathered, their empty eyes watching as the fire grew. Henry stood among them, his expression unreadable. "The blood will always call for more." Jess ignored him. She ran towards the fields, towards the road that would take her far from this cursed place. Behind her, the farmhouse was a blazing inferno, the flames licking at the sky, devouring the Wardell family's legacy of death. But even as she ran, Jess could still feel it, the pull of the earth beneath her feet, the hunger that would never be sated. She had survived. Weeks passed, and Jess found herself miles away from the nightmare that was the Wardell farm. She had wandered aimlessly, trying to distance herself from the horrors, yet something always lingered. At night, in her dreams, she heard the whispers, the calls of the blood-soaked earth. She couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed her. One evening, as she washed her hands, she noticed something strange. The water in the basin turned a deep, dark red. Her hands, no matter how hard she scrubbed, were stained with blood. Panic set in as she backed away, the crimson liquid spilling onto the floor, soaking the wood beneath her, and then she heard it. The slow, deliberate creak of wood. Just like before, the harvest had begun again. And this time, there was no escape, the blood would never stop flowing, the earth demanded it. Forever, Jess's hands shook as the blood continued to pour from the faucet. She stumbled back, her pulse racing, her breath shallow. She wiped her hands frantically on her jeans, but the blood wouldn't stop. Thick and warm, it coated her skin, soaking into the fabric. "Not again," she whispered, her voice trembling. "No, no, no." She slammed the faucet off, but the red tide kept rising, swirling in the sink, filling the bathroom with the metallic stench of fresh blood. The air grew thick, oppressive, as if the very walls were closing in. Jess's vision blurred, throbbing pulse from beneath her feet. The blood was everywhere, on her hands, her clothes, her skin. It seeped into the floorboards, dripping through the cracks. Her heart pounded, her body shaking violently. The ground beneath her groaned, and suddenly, she was no longer in her small motel bathroom. She was back at the farm. Jess blinked, gasping for air. The once distant, nightmarish images of the Wardell farm were now in front of her. The barren fields stretched endlessly under a blood-red sky, the farmhouse still smoldering in the distance. But it wasn't burned to the ground, it stood tall and whole again, as if untouched by the fire. No. I left. I burned it. The sky cracked open above her, a terrible rumble echoing through the atmosphere. The earth below shifted, the soil trembling as though something massive was stirring beneath. Jess could feel it, the ancient hunger, deep below, waiting to be fed. Ahead of her, standing at the edge of the field, was Henry Wardell, his broad-brimmed hat casting a long shadow across the blood-soaked ground. His cleaver gleamed in the dying light, the crimson stains on his apron dark and wet. "I told you, girl," Henry's voice was low, dark, filled with an otherworldly malice. "You can't leave. The farm always finds you. The blood is in you now." Behind him, the figures of the dead rose from the soil, crawling their way out of shallow graves. Their faces were twisted in agony, their skin pale and translucent, their bodies torn and bloodied from the ritualistic slaughter they had endured, the victims Jess had tried to save, Ben, the woman from the barn, the countless others she hadn't even known about, all now staring at her with lifeless eyes. Jess staggered back, but there was no escape. The dead moved toward her, their hands out. They shuffled closer. Their eyes were blank, hollow, yet somehow filled with accusation. Jess could feel their pain, their suffering, as if their deaths were burning into her very soul. Henry stepped forward, his cleaver dragging in the dirt, leaving a trail of blood behind him. His eyes gleamed with something worse than hatred, an ancient, consuming need. "You were always part of this," he growled, his voice barely human. "You can't run from what you are." Jess's mind raced, the truth gnawing at her from the inside. She had escaped the farm. She had burned it down. So why was she here? Why had she been dragged back? She felt it, deep in her bones. This place wasn't just a farm. It was something older, darker. It had lived for generations, fed by blood, kept alive by the suffering of those who fell victim to the Wardell's twisted rituals. And now, it had claimed her. The blood wasn't just on her hands, it was in her veins. She stumbled forward, clutching her head as the truth assaulted her mind. Every scream, every drop of blood spilled in that barn, had woven her into the fabric of the farm itself. She wasn't just another victim. She was becoming part of the cycle. "No," Jess gasped, her voice shaking. I won't be one of you." Henry grinned, his teeth stained red. "You already are." The dead surrounded her now, their cold hands grasping at her arms, pulling her toward the center of the field. Jess struggled, but their strength was inhuman, their fingers like iron shackles. The earth shifted beneath her, and she realized with horror that the ground was opening up, a massive pit yawning wide, filled with blood and bones. It was an altar. And she was its next sacrifice. The earth groaned as Jess was dragged in a cacophony of anguish and torment. "Join us. Feed the earth. Let the blood flow." Jess screamed, thrashing against the cold hands pulling her down. But the more she struggled, the tighter their grip became. She felt the ground give way beneath her feet, and suddenly, she was falling into the pit, into the sea of blood that waited below. The blood enveloped her, thick and warm, filling her mouth, her lungs, her soul. It soaked into her skin, pulling her deeper, swallowing her whole. Jess felt her consciousness slipping away, the world above growing darker, more distant, but as she sank, she heard it, the faint echo of a heartbeat. Slow and rhythmic. It wasn't her own. It was the heartbeat of the farm, pulsing with life, fed by the blood of countless victims. And in that moment, Jess realized the terrible truth: she wasn't being sacrificed. She was being reborn. The blood was accepting her. Jess opened her eyes, gasping for breath. She was no longer sinking. She stood at the edge of the field once more, her body drenched in blood. The pit was gone, the dead no longer surrounding her, but something had changed. She looked down at her hands. The blood still covered her skin, but now, it pulsed with a life of its own. Her wounds were gone, her body healed. And deep inside her, she felt a power, a dark, twisted energy that coursed through her veins like fire. Henry stood before her, watching with approval. "You feel it, don't you? The farm's power. It's yours now." Jess's breath came in shallow gasps. The power surged within her, intoxicating and overwhelming. She could feel the farm beneath her feet, its hunger, its need. And she could feel the blood, every drop that had ever been spilled here, flowing through her. I won't be like you," Jess whispered, but her voice wavered. Henry grinned. "You already are." The farm lived alone in the field, the blood-soaked earth quiet beneath her feet. The farmhouse was gone, the Wardell family dead. But the farm remained. It would always remain. She turned, her eyes scanning the horizon. She could feel it now, people, miles away, wandering toward her, drawn by the same force that had claimed her. The blood called to them, just as it had called to her. A slow smile crept across her face. Despite herself, the farm was alive. And now, so was she. The farm would always hunger. And so would she. The blood would continue to flow. The harvest would never end, and somewhere, in the distance, another scream pierced the night.